So what happens if you're not trying to aim for these like
Yeah,
awesome resolutions?
there's kind of like that two camps thing, right? Where it's like
Yeah.
you've got the people who want the resolutions, the graphics, the art to look as like realistic as the technology will possibly allow them to go, and they will like remaster it again and again across different things, trying to like get it to look how they wanted it to look originally in their head. And then there's this other camp where like it looks the way that it looks on purpose, and they don't want it to look better, and maybe it's not very realistic, but it looks the way that it looks on purpose, right? Like, it's retro or it's stylized or it's, like, artistically placed that way, so, like, whether it came out 15 years ago or 15 years from now, like, maybe color balancing will be different, maybe, like, edges will be a tiny bit smoother, but, like, the overall look and the feel is gonna be exactly the same across time, which is really interesting. It's kind of like if James Cameron is the guy who is pushing technology as far as it will allow, and the movie or the game's just gonna look better and better and better, Kojima, like, then this is kind of the other side of that, which is like, the Wes Anderson, like, it's gonna look the way that he wants it to look. It's hyper stylized, like, we're using sets, we're using it's gonna be look the same if it were shot 10 years from now, like, we're not waiting on technology. I think you can tell games like that where it's like, if it gets a remaster, especially, or, like, ported to a new console, like, it looks almost exactly the same, and that's how you can tell that they weren't waiting on technology to change it, they wanted it to look that way, which is really fun.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, and actually, there is a cool part about, saying, "I'm not looking for the cutting edge thing right now. What I'm doing is I want to deliver my vision in the way that has been time tested or has been iterated on enough at this point that it's going to be smooth and it's going to look great, right? Like, and that's kind of in the camp of practical effects. I know that there's like bad practical effects and stuff like that, right? But the idea that at this point, after having done so many practical effects in a movie, you kind of pick up some tricks about how to make it look better on screen, or how to manufacture them quickly, or how to puppeteer them better, right? Because you're building off of stuff that other people have done, and it's a known quantity to do that. It's funny how controversial that choice can be in games sometimes. I'm thinking specifically like Castlevania, Symphony of the Night. Now we're like, "Oh my god, that is such an amazing game." But at that time when they were releasing things, for the PlayStation, they wanted everything to be 3D. They wanted to stand out and apart from the Super Nintendo and anything else that was on there, and the easiest way for someone who was not entrenched in this sort of stuff is to be like, "Look, it's not sprites, it's polygons, like, this is crazy." And, so Castlevania was greenlit, but almost begrudgingly, and it sounds crazy to think about that now, but what I really appreciate is some of the trade-offs that they were able to get from that, right? So, because they were using a sprite engine, the cool thing about that is that they were able to do combat maybe a little bit better. It was the best 2D Castlevania up until that point, and again, it was because they made the choice specifically to look at tech that they were comfortable with, and tech that had some of the creases ironed out, and use that as the way that they're going to render it, and then the focus shifted back onto like, okay, so what are the cool game design things that we can change and that we can edit to kind of support this and to make it a better game. And so that's why you got like um all the different things that you could see inside of the castle, all the different weapons and enemy types, the save systems, the non-linearity sort of stuff on it, because that's where the effort came back into it. And that's why I made that controversial statement in another section, that having that pull in two different directions is maybe not what you want. It's all about the vision, right? Like, it's all about where you want to take them. And if you can rely on other things that have been, battle tested, why not? Especially if your focus is on the interaction, the difference in interaction, and what you can do differently there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, I think that's part of the reason why so many indie games tend to go in this direction. If triple
Mm,
A games are always chasing the best looking graphics that the console can allow or that technology allows at the time. Like indie games tend to go almost in the opposite direction, not just because of like marketing or stylization, but because of like needs. I mean, you're not going to have the same resources, obviously, but also just the time spent. Like, where do you want to spend your time? Like on 3D modeling and rendering and trying to make it look gorgeous, like maybe depending on the game, but a lot of times you just want to spend it on like polishing your game mechanics or your story or whatever. And you don't want to spend your time on that, or you're not a professional in that. The indie game, like A Short Walk, the creator did a great GDC talk on how he did the art for that game based off of his own limitations, right? Like he wanted to do 3D models, but he didn't want them to be super detailed. So he made this own filter over it so that it would look kind of chunky and pixely. And it's like people love the art of that game. And if it were to be remastered 15 years from now, it would look the same as it looks right now because it's become kind of this like iconic thing for that game. You wouldn't ever take that out of that game, it's part of it, but it was just because he wanted to do something that was cheaper or faster or easier for him, and it's not always that way, right? Like, Wind Waker, the Zelda game, is gorgeous, and people always talk about how beautiful that game is. I'm sure that they didn't do that to save time and money, right? Like, they didn't do that because it was easier, they did it because it was a stylization choice, but again, it's a game where, like, if it's remastered, it's gonna look really, really similar, if not exactly the same.
Yeah, I do gotta say that there's something to be said about, I guess, like, audience expectation for the game or the genre, that sort of stuff, and, The Legend of Zelda is one example of, like, where that didn't quite gel, especially, like, with the Wind Waker, because they were like, it's an adventure with a kid, and so, like, let's make it look like a Saturday morning cartoon. People will be into that. They were not into that. It's
Which
actually
is
kind of
wild.
funny. Right, like, well, people see it now, and again, this is kind of what we're exactly what we're talking about, right? Like, they did it in a stylistic way. They didn't feel limited, or they didn't feel the necessity to reach that photorealistic, cutting edge sort of thing, which eventually is going to, hopefully, because tech progresses, it's going to look bad at one point, right? Because it's no longer going to be cutting edge. Instead of doing that, they focus specifically on, this is a style that we want to hit. We want to make it look like a cartoon, and we're going to do everything in our power to make it look like a cartoon. And that's not necessarily going to be the most taxing thing on your console, and that's great because then you can focus on gameplay. And it has the added effect that now when you look back on it, it still looks really good. Maybe it's because we don't have a reference point of, like, what would an ultra texturized version of the Wind Waker with photorealistic sort of stuff look like, because it looks like a cartoon and it was meant to look like a cartoon. I could see ways that they could swap out the textures. Maybe they do the thing that's hot right now that they did for some Kirby games or some Yoshi games, and make it so that there's more texture to the individual, like, parts of it, right? Like, so it looks like cutout paper or something like that. But really, there's no reference for what an HD version of this would look like. And same sort of thing with other games, like, that are just kind of weird too, right? Like, that are just kind of like, we want you to focus on the new mechanic. We don't want you to be distracted by the other stuff. Parappa the Rappa, I think, is maybe a good example of that. Or Katamari, I think, is a really good example of that, right? Where, like, the new thing is that weird control scheme and being able to push that ball to make it bigger. We want you to focus on that. And so that's your focus. That's where the interesting stuff is going to be. Everything else is going to be hyper stylized because it's weird anyway. So, yeah. Um, it is funny though that, like, the backlash on the Wind Waker was so severe that the Twilight Princess that came afterwards was like a response to that. And this is kind of what I was saying in terms of expectations of game and genre too. Like, Western audiences definitely had a very different idea of what the Legend of Zelda was. But this idea that, like, sprites, you as a player have to do a little bit more work to imagine what they would look like as a real person, or imagine what is going on the screen, right? It's abstracted to a degree. And so you have some people playing The Legend of Zelda thinking that it looks like a Saturday morning cartoon, maybe even the developers like Miyamoto and stuff like that, right? And then you got people at home being like, "Oh, this is awesome. This is exactly like the Lord of the Rings that I imagine," right? Because but it's limited at that time, you have to infer. And then as the graphics get better and better, they're like, "Wait a minute, this isn't what I had in mind. This is a tonal shift. Like I have to reconcile that, and sometimes that reconciliation is ugly. And I think the Wind Waker had it kind of bad because E3 demos and all those sort of demos are infamously regarded for looking better than what the actual thing happens or what comes out. And before the Wind Waker was announced, they actually had a ultra high definition video of Link against Ganon, and what they showed was much more darker and moody, and so people thought that that was the direction that it
Oh,
was gonna go, and it was off of, like, the Ocarina of Time. So then it was like, "Nope, not Ocarina of Time with harsher textures and all this sort of stuff. Here's a cartoon," and people just lost their minds. And so, Twilight Princess came out, it was more in line with that, and at least in the West, it sold super well. I think they've got a happy medium now, right? Like with Breath of Wild, which looks a little bit more like like a Ghibli film or something like that. Then so I think it's nice that it's kind of like a middle ground of that. It still has some tune shading, but it still has some realistic elements of it. They did a great job
right.
appeasing of audience that is really hard to appease.
Yeah, I mean, no matter what kind you're using, whether you're like being hyper realistic, like graphics or like going more stylized, it's like it's always more stylized than you think it is, right? Because it's like we say like hyper realistic, crazy high graphics, but like if you're not doing like an actual like person, like you're still stylizing, right? Like Hideo Kojima is literally scanning people to get them in, but they don't like look like people, right? Or like we've talked about the Final Fantasy VII remake has unbelievable graphics, but like those aren't human being people. Those are like anime characters that are crazy high graphic, right? It's like their proportions don't make sense. Their hair doesn't make sense. Like it's not real just because it's realistic. It's like it's just a different kind of stylized that happens to work better with these really high resolution graphics. And like some stylization looks better with less, like toon shading with a really harsh line on all the shadows from Wind Waker looks better or the same regardless of graphics versus like this anime super realistic looking character looks great with higher graphics. So they're all just kind of like doing their own stylization and marketing, just depending based off of like what kind of resolution they want to be using. But I mean, that's across the board now. Now, if you get into indie spaces and you're not talking about like AAA marketing or any of that, you've got people making all sorts of stuff. Like people are making pixel art games
Yeah,
that are meant to look as if they're from like the 80s, right? Like people who are
right.
saying like you can only use 3 colors and you can only use this many pixels and like there's all sorts of game jams about it. It's a whole thing and it's like on purpose they want it to look like this, right?
Right, right. I don't wanna speak to, like, everybody on this, but I know that I personally, love this whole sort of push for, like, retro game development. I think it's so cool, and a part of me, I think, feels that because, like, now that I can make games, like, back when I couldn't, I was like, "Wouldn't it be really cool to be able to, like, load up a game that I made into the Game Boy or onto the whatever, on a console, make it legit some way, right? Like, and I think a lot of people are kind of realizing those dreams by being like, yeah, I made a game for the Game Boy. Now, currently, now that like the Game Boy's been out of print for a long, long time, right? Like, but there seems to be a market for that. There's definitely a lot of retro games out there and retro consoles that are being sold. Like Analog is doing a lot of that sort of stuff too. And I know that for me, it was so cool being able to see like something that I made in Unity or whatever, like get on screen on Xbox or something. Like I think
Oh,
that the fact that like the Xbox ones were all able to be development kits that you could put something on there is so cool. I also think that it's cool that a lot of people are kind of also doing like they're developing for retro consoles that never existed in the first place, which I think is kind of cool. Like the Pico 8 or the Plate 8 that have these like really hard limits on what you can do in terms of the graphical display or in terms of the hardware that it's running, but you do it on purpose because you're trying to see if you could do that or you like those limitations. Can you express your game and make something playable with the specs of the Pico 8 or inside of that?
yeah. Those are super cool. I I think that, like, when it comes to specifically, like, being super retro or, like, the Pico 8 or stuff like that, I have to take it with a grain of salt because I do think that, like, people who are into games or game development are more into those things than, like, your
Yeah.
average
Oh
person.
yeah. Oh yeah.
But I also, like, that's also true for the other direction, right? It's like people who go on and on about frames per second and crazy graphics and how they want more and more and more. It's like those are also not your average person, right? I mean,
Right.
like Animal Crossing is a game that is heavily stylized, always has been. Like, you can take the Animal Crossing that, like, I played as a kid on my DS, and if you played it nowadays, it doesn't look that different from what's out there, right? The style is the same, but, like, they're still releasing, like, the new Animal Crossing, like, 3.0 update. Like, they've got all these images close up where you can see, like, the new 3D renders of faces and, like, there's, like, no more of the little pixelization on the curves of the chin and all of that stuff, and it's kind of like, "Who is this for?" Right? Because it's like, the people who play Animal Crossing don't play it for the graphics, right? Like, so who is that advertisement for, right? When they're, like, going and they're saying, "Look at the updated graphics on Animal Crossing," right? It's like Animal Crossing diehard fans, maybe, but I think they care more about content, right? And it's like, it's already a stylized game. They don't care that much about crazy graphics in this game in general. So, is it more just about advertising, like, the Switch 2 than it is about the actual game, which is where I think a lot of that push kind of comes back and forth with on stylization anyway, but it's very funny to see those sorts of things.
You know, you make a great point about like Pico 8 and things like the Plate 8 having a very specific audience. It's devs making for other devs because
Yeah.
of course it is, right? It makes me think of like, amateur filmmakers who are like, I need this to run on a Super 8 because I got to have, the celluloid. It's got to have that real, it gives some sort of authenticity on it. And I think that is kind of the appeal for some of these hobby consoles, right? Like, can I do that in this? That's also part of the reason probably why they're trying to get Doom to run on absolutely everything, right? Like it's can I do it? Is it cool? Could I have made a Game Boy game if I was around during the time when it was really hot? Well, I don't know, but I made one right now. And there's also some cool stuff about like working around limitations and stuff, which is cool. So, thank you for listening to us talk about resolutions. If you like that or any other game dev topics, we have a lot to talk about. So, follow us here or on any social media. We're all over the place. It's Video Game Workshop, and we'll see you on the next talk.